demand for food in Sub-Saharan Africa is being driven by three distinct trends: growing populations, rapid urbanization, and changing diets as people become more affluent. This implies that significant increases in staple crop production are required through arable land and productivity increases to meet the growing demand. Joining us now to discuss whether Africa is rising to the occasion on food security is Dr. Grant Hatch, the Managing Executive for Strategy at Accenture in South Africa. Grant, thanks for your time. Now, these days,
good evening.
It's very fashionable to talk about Africa and the Africa opportunity, and now people are adding to that discussion the whole issue around Africa's agriculture opportunity, because there's this stat that keeps being rolled on by people, and that's that Africa is home to 70% or 60%, if you believe some people, of the world's arable land. How big is this opportunity, do you think?
I think it's a significant opportunity, because really what you're seeing in Africa is, and particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, is a shift from export-led resource extraction economies towards a focus on increased domestic food production. And the main driver of that is countries are finding it increasingly difficult to fund food imports. So currently, Sub-Saharan Africa imports about $50 billion worth of food per year. Nigeria is about 10 billion of that. And it's not a sustainable model to export resources and import food. Whilst Africa sits on around 60 to 70% of the remaining arable land in the world, much of it is used for small-scale or subsistence production. And the real opportunity is converting that to integrating into a larger, more commercial agricultural production environment. And really, if you look at it, you've had what's triggered economic development in the West. It happened in Asia, it happened in China, it happened in South America and Brazil. Was an agricultural revolution. I mean, we described it as the missing revolution. It hasn't occurred yet in Africa. So there's that enormous opportunity to shift from resource-driven towards a broader agricultural economy. And that's really what's required to underpin the growth in consumers and consumer spending within the African markets.
I'm hoping that you'll be able to tell our politicians what's required to make sure that that revolution takes place, because we know about the problem of food and, of course, the politics of the stomach. Politicians do not want in any way to lose control of their ability to control food prices and ensure that people do not turn against them and rise up against their rule.
Absolutely. I think, and that's what's really focusing politicians across Africa's attention on this issue, because it's not only on the price volatility around food. So don't forget, food prices are about 90% correlated with oil prices. So as we see oil price volatility increase, food price volatility increases. It's not only that, it's the fact that availability becomes an issue, is that governments reach the point where they simply can't import food. And that becomes very dangerous from a political stability point, which places great emphasis then on increasing domestic production to make sure there's self-sufficiency. And again, there are many examples of this happening. Brazil went from a net food import in the 70s, focusing very strongly on agricultural development, and became one of the largest exporters of food. So it can be done. The point is, Africa sits with an enormous amount of arable land, water, and production potential in very favorable conditions. It simply just needs to accelerate the development around that and start effectively utilizing those resources.
Now, Grant, you're talking about sustainability, and I'm looking at a new statistic coming in from the World Bank, basically saying that Africa's agriculture is worth about $310 billion currently. But if we do things right, in about 2030, we could look at about $1 trillion. How do we get to that point?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at Africa currently, you've got roughly about 65% of people in Sub-Saharan Africa employed in agriculture, so it's a huge creative employment, and it contributes about a third of GDP. And the opportunity is really to use the agricultural base through development to stimulate downstream manufacturing, to stimulate the consumer environment, and then eventually retail, and develop a broader mixed economy. So if you look at a country, let's take Angola, for example, highly dependent on oil and diamond exports, the great opportunity is utilize the arable land and develop that into a much more broader based economy, and agriculture is really the catalyst that achieves that. So, the World Bank figures, report, does give you some sense of the scale of which the change could occur, and that's really the underpinning catalyst. So, what is required for that to take place? Well, firstly, what you've got to do, as I highlighted earlier, most of agriculture in Africa at the moment is small-scale subsistence focused, is link those farmers into commercial markets. There's infrastructure challenges, there's access to capital challenges, many challenges that are going to be overcome, but really linking those small-scale farmers to markets. In addition, linking into a more mixed, where you've got mid-size and large-scale commercial farming. So, if you look at countries that have reached that level of development, if you see the footage you're seeing on your screens now, that's large-scale commercial mechanized agriculture taking place. That's what's really required to actually start developing the surpluses that are required to stimulate the local economy and become involved in exports.
Yeah.
That's the real key driver. And so coming back to the political dimension is, what policies are governments putting in place to stimulate agricultural development? And you're seeing that taking place now in Nigeria. You've got an agricultural transformation agenda. You're seeing it in Ethiopia, similar transformation, a focus on shifting agriculture away from small-scale subsistence focus towards a more commercial production environment, and to actually start creating a more developed and more broader-based economy. And so that pattern is going to roll out across Africa as key countries try and become more self-sufficient in food.
Yeah, but now how do we address the other sensitivities around land ownership in Africa? Because we do know that Africa, of course, comes from a colonial past where you had these large farms that were given to outsiders, if you want, white people that came to settle on the continent. So there's these sensitivities on the part of the governments to try to make sure that there's food security. But at the same time, there's also the very sensitive issue around who owns the land. And fairly or unfairly, you've got people who insist they want their piece of the land.
No, that's a very key point you raised, because equally what you don't want happening is a large-scale conversion into commercial agriculture at the expense of local communities and destabilize local communities. Don't forget, there's another trend that's taking place that you highlighted right at the outset, is that urbanization rising from about 40% currently now to about 62% by 2050. So a large number of people will move in any case out of rural areas into the urban economy, which is part of the development process. But you are right, there's a huge sensitivity about land ownership in Africa. And what governments have tended to do is to actually limit land ownership. So there's typically leasehold arrangements and put provisions on the conversion of land. So where investors are coming in, there's requirements to actually limit the period in which they have the land, also to require that that land is developed and it's managed appropriately. So governments, I think, are starting to learn that controlling that land is a valuable asset. One also hears about governments, if you look, there's a lot around Chinese, large numbers of, or large tracts of land being taken up by foreign land ownership.
Yeah.
I think that's created some of the political sensitivity. So it's not necessarily individual owners or necessarily companies, but large-scale land acquisition at country level, which does raise concerns about future food security, where countries might have the production environment, but they don't actually control the asset anymore.
Yeah. Grant, we're running out of time. Just one quick question, though. Should we develop two models of ownership, perhaps? One that takes care of the rural considerations and, of course, the historical aspect around land ownership, and that one which also caters to investors and people who want to come in and invest in land and farm at a profit?
I think, one of the key issues here is not about an either-or model. It's a partnership model. So, there's a huge opportunity to integrate small-scale producers who actually control and own their own land into larger production value chains. And so a lot of the work we've done is looking at how do you actually create transformation, not necessarily about changing land ownership, but creating the integration or the linkages between small-scale producers and end markets. Equally, in bringing in commercial producers, but one of the key elements that they're going to require is the security of tenure. The problem in agriculture, it's a long-term investment business. The returns take time to develop. And so to get investors that are prepared to be patient with their capital requires that they have some security over that land tenure. But even leasehold arrangements, whether they 99-year leasehold, even shorter than that, does give them that security. So I think the two models can coexist quite comfortably. The key issue is how those are integrated into a value chain that creates opportunities and creates the value back to both small and commercial farmers.